Virgin only 18 forced to marry a 40 years. CEO, but after one night of passion, everything changed. The dress didn't fit right. Elena Marsh stood in front of the floor-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ivory gown that had been ordered, paid for, and delivered without anyone asking her size, without anyone asking her anything. The lace at the collar was too tight, the waist cinched in a way that made breathing feel like a privilege she hadn't earned. And the veil, long, theatrical, trailing like something from a funeral, kept catching on the corner of her dresser every time she turned. She was 18 years old. Tomorrow she would be someone's wife. Not just someone's, his, Marcus Hale, CEO of Hale Industries, 40 years old. A man whose face she had seen exactly 3 times in her life. Once across a boardroom when she was 16, and her father had dragged her to one of his meetings, once in a newspaper photograph that made him look carved from stone, and once, briefly, 2 weeks ago when the engagement had been announced, and he had shaken her hand like she was a business contact he didn't particularly need. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't tried to. He had simply looked at her. Through her, really, said Miss Marsh in that low, detached voice, and turned back to speak to her father as though she had already left the room. She hadn't forgotten that. Elena reached up and pulled the veil from her hair, setting it on the dresser with more force than she intended. The silence of the house pressed in around her. Downstairs, she could hear the muffled sound of her father on a call, laughing, relaxed, closing some deal that had apparently required the sacrifice of his only daughter to seal. She didn't use the word sacrifice dramatically. She used it because it was accurate. Hale Industries had bailed out Marsh Financials 8 months ago when her father's company had nearly collapsed under the weight of his own poor decisions. The terms of the deal had been restructuring, acquisition, partnership, all the clean corporate words that meant we own you now. But apparently they hadn't been enough. 3 months ago, her father had come home with a different kind of arrangement, one that would solidify the partnership, he'd said, one that would secure their family's future, one that involved Marcus Hale needing a wife, for reasons her father had explained in vague terms about reputation, inheritance law, and a board vote that required him to appear settled. And Elena, young, unmarried, conveniently available, had been offered as the solution. She hadn't been asked. She had been informed. Now she stood in an ivory dress that didn't fit, in a room she was about to leave forever, and she pressed one hand flat against the mirror and looked at the girl staring back at her. Who are you going to be after tomorrow? She didn't have an answer. That was the part that scared her most. Not him, not the wedding, not the strange house she'd be moving into in 48 hours. It was the not knowing. In the sense that the girl in the mirror was about to step through a door that would close silently behind her. A knock came at the door. Elena, her best friend Piper's voice, careful and soft. Can I come in? Yeah. Piper slipped inside and stopped when she saw her, standing at the mirror in the full gown, veil discarded, one hand still pressed to the glass. Piper was the kind of person who always knew what to say. Tonight, for once, she said nothing for a long moment. Then, you look beautiful. I look like someone else's idea of beautiful, Elena said quietly. Piper crossed the room and stood beside her, both of them reflected in the mirror now. Piper in her jeans and oversized sweater. Elena in ivory lace that belonged to a life she hadn't chosen. You don't have to do this, Piper said, even though they both knew she was wrong. Elena dropped her hand from the mirror. Yes, she said softly, I do. And the worst part, the part she hadn't told anyone, not even Piper, was that somewhere beneath the fear and the quiet fury and the terrible tightness of the dress, there was something else, something she couldn't name yet. She had stood across from Marcus Hale for less than 4 minutes total in her entire life, but she remembered every second of all 4. The way he'd looked at her, just before he turned away. Just for a moment, like something in him had paused, like she had caught him off guard and he hadn't liked it. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it meant anything at all. But she thought about it more than she should have, more than was safe. So dearest viewers, have you ever had to walk into something you were terrified of, but some small, quiet part of you was also drawn to it? Tell us in the comments. You're not alone. The wedding was small. That had been Marcus Hale's only request, if you could call it that. His assistant had relayed it through Elena's father like a memo. Mr. Hale prefers an intimate ceremony. No press, no extended guest lists. Efficient. Efficient. Elena had read that word 3 times and decided it was the most unromantic thing she had ever heard in her 18 years of life. The ceremony took place in a private hall on the 14th floor of a building that Marcus apparently owned. Because of course he did. Cream walls, tall windows overlooking the city. 40 guests maximum. Everything tasteful, everything expensive. On everything chosen by someone else. There were white orchids on the tables that Elena hadn't picked. A string quartet playing something classical she didn't recognize. A wedding cake that was technically flawless and looked like it had been ordered from.
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. All right, back to the story.
A catalog under the category appropriate. Elena stood at the back of the room in the ivory gown that still didn't fit right, holding a bouquet of white roses she hadn't chosen, and tried to breathe evenly. Piper stood to her left, serving as maid of honor in a dusty rose dress, gripping Elena's free hand with quiet ferocity. "Still not too late to fake a medical emergency," Piper whispered. "Piper, I'm just saying, a well-timed feint. Very dramatic, very effective." Elena almost smiled. Almost. "He'd probably just step over me and reschedule." Piper pressed her lips together. "Yeah, he probably would." And then the doors at the far end of the room opened, and Elena saw him. Marcus Hale stood at the front of the room in a charcoal suit so precisely fitted it looked like it had been sewn directly onto him. Dark hair, silvering slightly at the temples, jaw sharp enough to cut glass. He stood with the posture of someone who had never once slouched. Not in exhaustion, not in casualness, not in anything so human as uncertainty. His hands were clasped in front of him. His expression was neutral in the way that marble statues are neutral. Completely still, completely unreadable. He wasn't looking at her yet. He was looking at his watch. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Right. Efficient. She walked down the aisle to the sound of the string quartet and 40 pairs of eyes she barely registered. When her father walked beside her, smiling the practiced smile of a man who believed he had solved a problem. He patted her hand once before releasing it at the altar, and Elena had to resist the very specific urge to hold on. Not because she wanted his comfort, but because letting go meant stepping forward. She stepped forward. Marcus finally looked at her, and there it was again. That thing she hadn't been able to explain to herself since the engagement. That momentary pause in his expression. Not warmth, not softness, not anything so simple as attraction. Just a pause. Like a breath he didn't quite take. Like something in him registered her presence, and briefly, involuntarily, didn't know what to do with it. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then it was gone, and he was marble again. The ceremony was brief. The officiant spoke, and they exchanged vows that had been pre-written by someone in a legal department somewhere. Elena was almost certain of it. When it came time for the rings, Marcus slid the band onto her finger with careful precision, and his thumb pressed briefly, barely against her knuckle as he released her hand. She felt it for the rest of the day. The reception was where Elena first understood the shape of the life she had entered. Marcus Hale was not a cruel man. She registered that early. He didn't ignore her with contempt or dismiss her with visible disdain. He was simply occupied. Moving through the room with the ease of someone who owned every space he inhabited, speaking to guests in the low, assured tones of a man whose time was always currency. He checked his phone twice, but he had a conversation near the window with 2 men in expensive suits that lasted longer than any conversation he had with her. Elena sat at the head table with Piper on one side and an empty chair on the other, eating wedding cake that tasted like nothing in particular, and watched her new husband work a room at his own wedding. "He didn't even try the cake," Piper observed. "He probably has someone who tastes things for him. Like a king. Like a very busy accountant." Piper snorted, and that was the moment Elena decided she was going to be fine. Not happy, She wasn't delusional, but fine. She would build something in the margins of this arrangement. She would take up space in whatever corners he left unoccupied. She would survive this, and she would remain herself while doing it. She believed that. She believed it right up until Marcus appeared at her side without warning, settled into the chair beside her, and said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Elena turned to look at him. It was the closest they had been. She could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. The slight tension in his jaw that she was already beginning to suspect was permanent. "For what?" she asked. "For this." His gaze moved across the room briefly. "It wasn't what you would have wanted. I'm aware of that." She studied him for a moment. There was no warmth in the statement, but there was something. Honesty, maybe. The particular honesty of someone who doesn't do softness, but occasionally does accuracy. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He nodded once like she'd confirmed a calculation. "The house is large. You'll have your own space. I'm rarely home before 8. I travel frequently." He paused. "I'm not expecting anything from you beyond what the arrangement requires." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "And what does the arrangement require?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort. He didn't seem like a man who was easily discomfited, but something adjacent to it. Like the question had touched an edge he hadn't prepared for. "Appearances," he said finally. "A few events per quarter. Nothing unreasonable." "Right." She turned back to the room. "Efficient." She heard the slight pause before he responded. "You read the memo." "My father forwarded it." Another pause. And then, quietly, unexpectedly, something that wasn't quite a laugh. A short exhale through his nose. The ghost of amusement. Waned there and gone so fast she almost missed it. "I'll choose better words next time," he said. It was such a small thing, such an almost nothing of a moment, but Elena felt it shift something in her chest very slightly, like a door that had been stuck suddenly moving a half inch on its hinges. She didn't look at him. "You do that," she said softly. The house was, as stated, large. It sat in a quiet, tree-lined part of the city where all the buildings had the kind of architecture that whispered old money in a polite indoor voice. 4 stories, high ceilings. Rooms that felt designed for a life lived at a formal distance from itself. Marcus's housekeeper, a composed woman named June, who had clearly run this household longer than Elena had been alive, gave her a tour with practiced efficiency. The kitchen. The library, which was the first room that made Elena stop and truly look around, because the shelves ran floor to ceiling and the books were clearly read, not decorative. The garden entrance. The east wing. "Mr. Hale has the master suite on the 3rd floor," June said, neutral and informative. "Your room has been prepared on the 2nd floor, east end. It has its own bathroom and sitting area." "Your room, not your suite, not the guest room." June had chosen the word carefully, Elena realized. She was trying to make it feel intentional, like a gift rather than a partition. "Thank you," Elena said and meant it. Her room was beautiful. Pale walls, tall windows, with a view of the garden, a window seat lined with cushions in deep teal, a writing desk, bookshelves waiting to be filled. Someone, Marcus, Ada or June on his instruction, had placed a small vase of white ranunculus on the nightstand. Not roses, not orchids, something softer. Elena stood in the center of it and decided quietly that this was hers now. This room, this window, this view. She would start here. She met Marcus over breakfast the next morning in the most unglamorous possible way. She came downstairs at 7 in pajama pants printed with small yellow stars and an oversized university sweatshirt. The college she hadn't been able to attend because the arrangement had moved faster than enrollment deadlines. And found him already at the kitchen island, in a full suit, reading the Financial Times, drinking espresso, looking every inch the immovable force of a man who had probably never owned pajamas with stars on them. He looked up. She stopped in the doorway, and there was a beat of silence. "Good morning," he said, in the same tone he probably used to open board meetings. "Morning," she managed. She looked down at her star pajamas, looked back up at him, and decided the only available move was dignity. She crossed to the coffee machine with her chin up, figured it out after a humiliating 45 seconds of pressing the wrong buttons, and poured herself a cup. She turned around to find him looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, and quickly looking back at his newspaper. June stocks the kitchen on Mondays, he said to the Financial Times. If there's anything specific you want, you can add it to the list on the refrigerator. Okay. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Do you always wear a full suit at 7 in the morning? A pause. Do I have a 7:30 meeting? On the day after your wedding? Another pause. Longer this time. The board doesn't observe personal milestones, he said. Elena looked at him over her coffee mug. He was still reading his newspaper, or pretending to, and something about the set of his shoulders told her that he was aware of how that had sounded, that he wasn't proud of it necessarily, that he simply didn't know how to be anything other than what he was. Right, she said softly. Well, good luck with the board. She took her coffee and went back upstairs, and Marcus Hale sat alone in his kitchen, in his 7:30 suit, and did not read a single word of the Financial Times for the next 4 minutes. The first week passed like two strangers sharing a waiting room, polite, careful, structured around the architecture of avoidance. Marcus left before 7:30 every morning and returned after 8 every evening. Elena learned the sound of his car in the driveway, a low, quiet engine, nothing showy, and the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the hardwood when he came through the front door. She learned that he always set his keys in the same dish by the entrance, that he loosened his tie exactly halfway before he reached the kitchen, that he would stand at the counter for a few minutes eating whatever June had left covered on the stove, and then disappear upstairs without ceremony. She learned all of this the way you learn the habits of weather. Not because she was watching, she wasn't. She was simply there. But because patterns reveal themselves when two people occupy the same space and pretend they aren't. She spent her days quietly building her corner of the house. She filled the bookshelves in her room. She claimed the window seat completely and without apology, piling it with cushions and paperbacks, and the small potted succulent Piper had brought over during her first approved visit. She started running in the mornings through the tree-lined streets outside, mostly to have somewhere to put the restless energy that came from being 18 and indefinitely unscheduled. She cooked occasionally, simple things, pasta, soup, and left the kitchen exactly as she found it. She and Marcus crossed paths at breakfast most days. Their conversations were brief and functional. Coffee's fresh. June called about Thursday. There's a charity event on the 15th. I'll have details sent to you. Always the arrangement. Always the logistics. She told herself that was fine. Then on a Tuesday evening in the second week, everything quietly rearranged itself. Elena was in the library when she heard it. She had discovered early that the library was the one room in the house that felt genuinely lived in. The books had cracked spines and margin notes. The leather armchair by the window had the particular softness of something used regularly, and there was always a half-finished cup of something on the side table that June hadn't cleared yet. She had started spending evenings there, telling herself she wasn't waiting for anything, just reading. She was 3 chapters into a novel when the front door opened earlier than usual. 6:15. She noted it without meaning to. She heard the keys in the dish. The footsteps, different tonight, heavier, slower, not the crisp, but even stride she'd cataloged. These footsteps had the dragging quality of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. She went back to her book. 10 minutes later, Marcus appeared in the library doorway. He had loosened his tie completely. First time she'd seen that. His jacket was gone. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He looked at her with the slightly unfocused expression of someone who had walked into a room and found it occupied by someone they'd forgotten lived there. Sorry, he said. I didn't know you were in here. It's your library, Elena said. It's your house, too. She looked at him more carefully then. There was something around his eyes, a tightness that wasn't his usual controlled precision. Something quieter. Something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like exhaustion that went deeper than tired. Sit down, she said, before she'd thought about whether to say it. He looked at her. You look like you've had an awful day, she added, with the calm matter-of-factness of someone who saw no point in pretending otherwise. The other chair's comfortable. I'm not going to make conversation if you don't want any. A long pause. Then Marcus Hale, CEO, marble statue, man who had entire floors of buildings named after him, crossed the library and sat down in the chair across from her. He didn't speak. She went back to her book. For 20 minutes, they sat in the library together in complete silence. The lamp between them cast a warm, low light. Outside, the city made its distant sounds. Elena turned pages. Marcus sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the middle distance with the look of someone slowly depressurizing. It was the most comfortable Elena had felt in 2 weeks. She suspected, though she couldn't have explained why, that it was the most comfortable he had felt too. My company is being investigated. She looked up. Marcus was still in the same position. Elbows on knees, hands loosely clasped. He hadn't looked at her. He was speaking to the middle of the room, and she had the sense that the words had come out because the silence had made them possible. Not because he decided to say them. Investigated for what? She asked, keeping her voice even. A former board member is alleging financial misconduct. It's baseless. A beat. But baseless doesn't mean manageable. Elena set her book down in her lap. How long has this been happening? 3 months. 3 months. The same 3 months in which the arrangement had been proposed, agreed upon, and executed. Something clicked into place quietly in Elena's mind. The board vote. The need to appear settled. It wasn't just inheritance law or image management. He had needed the ground to stop moving. He had needed something solid. He had needed her in his way, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She tucked the feeling away for later. Is your position secure? She asked. He glanced at her then, briefly with the slight surprise of someone not expecting a practical question. For now, my legal team is managing it, but the press will find it within the week, and when they do, he stopped. When they do, you'll need to look like a man whose life isn't unraveling, Elena finished quietly. He looked at her for a moment longer this time. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. Okay. Okay, he repeated, like the word was foreign. I said I would help with the arrangement, she said simply. That includes this. Tell me what you need. Something moved across his face. Not gratitude, he didn't seem like a man who wore gratitude visibly, but something close to it. Something that looked like being seen when you hadn't expected to be. There's a gala, he said after a moment. Friday. It'll be the first public appearance that matters. Then we should look like people who chose each other, Elena said. He was quiet for a moment. We should, he agreed. The preparation for the gala was where proximity stopped being theoretical. Marcus's stylist, a composed, precise woman named Diane who treated fashion as a form of engineering, arrived Thursday morning with a rack of gowns and the energy of someone who had dressed women for events that shaped careers. Elena stood in the center of the living room, while Diane moved around her with pins and opinions, and tried not to feel like a prop being prepared for a stage. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the living room midway through, still in his work clothes, tablet in hand, and stopped. Elena was in the third gown of the session, deep navy, draped silk, off the shoulder. Simple, precise, the kind of dress that didn't try to make noise and didn't need to. Diane was still talking. Elena was looking at herself in the portable mirror, trying to decide if she felt like herself or like someone else's idea of herself again. And then she registered Marcus in the reflection. He was looking at her with that expression. The pause. Longer this time, undisguised for approximately 3 full seconds before he caught himself. The Navy, he said to Diane, as though he'd been asked. Then he looked back at his tablet and walked away. Diane turned to Elena with an expression of professional neutrality that was doing a tremendous amount of work. The Navy it is, she said. Elena looked at herself in the mirror. Her cheeks were warmer than they should have been. Thursday evening, Marcus found her in the kitchen. She was stress baking, which she hadn't done since high school, but apparently marriage and galas and corporate investigations brought out old coping mechanisms. She was making chocolate chip cookies from memory, flour on her forearms. My hair piled up with a pencil because she'd lost her hair tie, when he walked in at his usual time and stopped at the sight of her. She turned around, caught the look on his face, something between bewilderment and something else she couldn't name, and pointed a wooden spoon at him. Don't say anything. I wasn't going to. You had a face. I always have a face. You had a specific face. The ghost of that almost laugh again. She was beginning to collect them, she realized, building a small catalog of the sounds he made when something caught him off guard. "What are you making?" he asked, setting his keys down and coming further into the kitchen, which felt notable. He didn't usually come further into the kitchen. "Cookies, chocolate chip." She turned back to the bowl. "Stress response. And I'm told it's healthier than other options." "Are you stressed?" "We have a gala tomorrow where I have to convince people that we are a real couple. And I've been your wife for 11 days, and I still don't know how you take your coffee." Silence, then. "2 sugars. No milk." She turned to look at him. He was standing on the other side of the island, jacket gone, tie loosened, and he looked almost human, almost accessible, like the marble had a hairline crack in it and the light was getting through. "2 sugars," she repeated. "You asked." "I did." She turned back to her cookies. "I take mine with a lot of milk and 1 sugar, in case you ever need to know." A pause. "I'll remember that," he said quietly, and she believed him. Friday morning arrived with the specific anxiety of a day that matters. Elena was in her room going over the mental list Piper had helped her build. Know the company name, know 2 board members, know his origin story, laugh at the right moments, don't look lost, when June knocked and delivered an envelope. Inside was a card, simple, cream, Marcus's handwriting, which she was surprised to find was clean and deliberate, not the careless scrawl of a busy man. "You don't have to perform tonight. Just be yourself. That will be enough." Elena read it twice. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and held it in both hands for a long moment. This small piece of paper with its 7 words of instruction that had somehow cracked something open in her chest she hadn't known was closed. That will be enough. Nobody had said that to her in a very long time. Maybe ever. She put the card in her nightstand drawer. She got ready for the gala. The gala was held in a building that knew exactly what it was. Grand without apology. All marble floors and soaring ceilings and chandeliers that caught light like they'd been commissioned specifically to make everyone beneath them feel slightly underdressed. Elena stepped out of the car and felt the city air on her shoulders, bare courtesy of the navy gown, and told herself to breathe. Marcus came around from his side and appeared at her elbow. He looked at her once, briefly, the way he'd been doing since the fitting, that contained, careful look that started at her face and didn't travel anywhere impolite, but somehow still managed to say something. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "No," she said honestly. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. To the place a smile lived before it decided whether to surface. "Good," he said. "Honest is better than rehearsed." And then he offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked into the light together. The first hour was performance. Elena had prepared. She knew the names of his 2 most important board members. Gerald Fitch, silver-haired and watchful, who shook her hand with the assessing grip of someone running calculations, and Patricia Osman, warm but precise, who kissed her cheek and said, "We've been curious about you," in a tone that meant something more layered than curiosity. She knew the company's founding year. She knew the right questions to ask and the right moments to laugh. What she hadn't prepared for was Marcus, not the public version. That one she'd expected. Assured, articulate, and filling every room with the particular gravity of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. That Marcus she had studied from the newspaper photograph. What she hadn't prepared for was the private channel that seemed to open between them the moment they walked in together. The way he kept her close without holding on. The way his hand would find the small of her back. Briefly, barely, just enough to guide her through a crowd or redirect her towards someone new, and then release her before she could decide how she felt about it. The way he angled his body toward her when someone else was speaking, just slightly, like a compass finding north. Like she was north. She told herself she was imagining it. She was probably imagining it. "You're doing well," he said quietly, appearing at her side between conversations. She had just finished a 7-minute exchange with Gerald Fitch about international market trends, during which she had deployed every piece of preparation she had, and also, apparently, a natural instinct for asking questions that made powerful men feel interesting. Fitch had walked away looking pleasantly surprised. He likes to be listened to, Elena said, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. Most people do. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You read people quickly. I grew up watching my father work rooms. A beat. I learned what it looks like when someone's performing and what it looks like when they're actually present. She glanced at him sideways. You're actually present, by the way, in case you were wondering. He looked at her. Most people at things like this are performing, she continued, looking back at the room. You're thinking. There's a difference. A pause. You're 18, he said, not unkindly, more like a man reminding himself of a fact he kept forgetting. Yes, she said pleasantly. Deeply inconvenient, I'm sure. That sound again, the exhale, the almost laugh, and this time it lasted a half-second longer than usual. Deeply, he agreed. Midway through the evening, Patricia Osman found them near the tall windows overlooking the city and insisted with the cheerful authority of someone used to getting what they wanted on hearing their story. How did you two meet? Properly meet, I mean. Not the business version your father gave the board. Elena felt Marcus go very slightly still beside her. Across, she felt the question land in the small space between them, like something that needed to be caught before it hit the ground. She caught it. He came to a meeting with my father, she said, with the ease of someone telling a story they'd told before. And I was there, pretending to be interested in quarterly projections. She glanced at Marcus. He didn't talk to me at all for the first hour. I didn't know you were there, Marcus said, which was, almost certainly, actually true, and landed perfectly as self-deprecating. He figured it out eventually, Elena continued, turning back to Patricia with a small smile. And when he did, he looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't accounted for. Patricia laughed delightedly. Marcus said nothing. But his hand found the small of her back again, and this time it stayed there a beat longer than necessary. Elena kept her expression perfectly calm and her breathing carefully even. They left at 10:30. The car was quiet. The city moved past the windows in streaks of light. Elena had her heels off before they'd reached the end of the block. They were in the footwell, her bare feet on the warm floor mat, and she had her head tilted back against the seat and her eyes half closed, running on the particular empty energy of a performance successfully completed. You told Patricia I looked at you like a problem, Marcus said after several minutes of silence. You did. I know. A pause. I'm not sure that was the detail I'd have chosen. It was true. Nah, and true details are more convincing than perfect ones. She turned her head to look at him without lifting it from the headrest. She believed us. He was looking forward, one hand on his knee, the particular composed stillness of a man in transit between versions of himself. The gala Marcus was receding. The kitchen at 8 p.m. Marcus was returning. You were remarkable tonight, he said quietly, still looking forward. Elena looked at the side of his face for a moment. You sound surprised, she said. I'm not surprised. A beat. I'm recalibrating. Recalibrating what? He didn't answer immediately. The car moved through a quiet stretch of road, the city softening around them into residential streets and old trees. My expectations, he said finally. It should have been a neutral statement. It was a neutral statement. And yet Elena felt it somewhere that neutral statements had no business reaching. She looked back at the window. Get some rest, Marcus, she said softly. You did well tonight, too. She heard the slight pause before he responded. Thank you, he said. She didn't think anyone had said that to him in a while either. The weeks that followed had a different texture. Something had shifted at the gala. Some invisible line in the architecture of their arrangement had moved, and neither of them mentioned it, and both of them noticed it constantly. Breakfast became longer. Not dramatically. 5 minutes became 15, 15 became 30. But the Financial Times stayed folded on the counter more often. The conversation stopped being logistical and started being something else, tentative, exploratory, the conversational equivalent of two people testing ice to see if it would hold. She learned things. He had grown up in a small city 3 hours north, in a house that had nothing in common with this one. He had put himself through university on a combination of scholarships and work that he mentioned only obliquely. The way people mention things that shape them so fundamentally, they've stopped registering the weight. He had built Hale Industries from a single consultancy firm over 15 years. He had no close family. He had colleagues he respected and no one he called. He learned things too. She had wanted to study literature. She had written short stories since she was 12, kept in notebooks she hadn't unpacked yet. She had a specific, uncompromising opinion about which adaptations of classic novels were worthy and which were crimes. She made chocolate chip cookies when she was anxious and pasta from scratch when she was sad. And she was, underneath the careful composure she wore like a second skin, quietly, persistently hopeful in a way that seemed to confuse him. "You're not angry," he said one morning over coffee, with the puzzled directness of someone who had been waiting for something and was disconcerted by its absence. She looked at him over her mug. "About what?" "This." He gestured briefly at the kitchen, at the house, at the general circumstance of their lives. Elena considered the question seriously, because he'd asked it seriously. "I was," she said, "for a while." She wrapped both hands around her mug. But anger at something you can't change is just." She paused, choosing. "It's like running on a treadmill. You exhaust yourself and you don't go anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. "So what do you do instead?" "Look for the parts that are actually mine," she said simply. "The window seat, the library, the cookies. A beat. The coffee order I now know by heart." Something moved through his expression, slow and complicated, like weather changing. "2 sugars," he said quietly. "2 sugars," she confirmed. It was a Wednesday when the almost happened. Elena was in the library late, past 10, the house quiet around her. She'd been writing. One of the old notebooks had finally come out of the box, and she'd been sitting cross-legged in the armchair, with it open in her lap. However, writing the way she used to before the arrangement had rearranged everything, with the particular absorption of someone who had found their way back to something they'd missed. She didn't hear Marcus come in. She became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in the quality of light, gradually and then all at once. He was in the doorway, still in his work clothes, later than usual. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the pause, not the almost laugh. Something quieter. Something that had more to do with the scene itself than with anything she'd done. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't want to interrupt." "You're not." She closed the notebook, finger marking the page. "Long day. Long week." He came in and settled in the opposite chair. His chair now. She'd started thinking of it as his, and sat in the easy silence that had become theirs over the past weeks. After a moment, he said, "What do you write?" She looked up. He was watching her with genuine curiosity. No agenda, no politeness. Just actually wanting to know. "Stories," she said. "Mostly." A beat. "People in difficult situations making small, human choices." "Why small?" "Because small choices are the real ones," she said. "The big dramatic ones are easy to write. It's the small ones that are actually hard. What you say when you don't know what to say. What you do when there's no good option." She paused. "What you choose when no one's watching." Silence. Marcus was looking at her with that expression again. The one she'd been trying to catalog and failing, right? Because it didn't fit any of the categories she'd assigned him when she'd first arrived. "Can I read something?" he asked. Her breath caught, very slightly, somewhere she hoped wasn't visible. "Someday," she said. "Someday," he repeated, like a promise she hadn't known she'd made, and he hadn't known he'd accepted. The lamp between them burned warm and steady. Outside, the city breathed, and Elena Marsh sat in the library of a house that was becoming hers, across from a man who was becoming something she didn't have a word for yet and wasn't sure she was ready to name, and felt the particular ache of something that was building too slowly to rush and too real to ignore. She turned back to her notebook. She did not write a single word for the rest of the night. "Dearest viewers," he asked to read her writing. She said someday. Do you think she was protecting herself or protecting him? Tell us what you think in the comments. Make sure you subscribe to this channel as we bring you part 2 of this interesting story.